Hello, and welcome to this Register webinar, in which we'll be explaining why you need an extended software bill of materials, or XBOM. An XBOM, as we will discover, is an up-leveled version of a software bill of materials, or SBOM. And if these terms are new or unfamiliar to you, then stay tuned and all will be explained. Just to flag up, our webinar audience can put questions directly to our speaker using the chat box next to the player, and we will pick those up as we go along. I'm your host, James Hayes, and I'm joined by our expert speaker from Apero. It's Aidan Elor, who is Apero's Global Solutions Engineering Manager. Aidan, welcome.
Thank you, James. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so our agenda today will scope a number of key areas. First of all, we'll be looking at the evolution of SBOM. We'll be identifying some SBOM gaps, areas where it's not really meeting its potential. We'll be looking at the difference between an SBOM and an XBOM, and we'll be also looking at the full range of benefits that SBOMs and XBOMs can bring to your enterprise, and a lot more besides. So let's open, Aidan, with a brief background to the concept of a software bill of materials. What is an SBOM, and how do they come into being?
Yeah, so with the growing complexity of cybersecurity threats and cybersecurity attacks, governments, institutions, organizations who need to secure their data because everything today is in the cloud and everything today is digitalized, realize that they need to form better cybersecurity practices along the way. One good example and one good driver for it would be like the Executive Order 14028 by the Biden administration, where basically speaks about the complexity and the growing complexity about cybersecurity threats and how attackers are trying to get in a very creative way into the organization data point and into the organization software supply chain, like the SolarWinds attack, for example. So some of the key areas focused in that executive order that started to drive that discussion would be around how government agencies can go and adopt zero trust cybersecurity practices and how to secure their entire software supply chain, how to enhance cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, how to prepare for the private sector or investing in the cyber talent, or basically more improving the cybersecurity awareness and education. Another good milestone in that perspective would be like the NIST framework that basically speaks about how to better secure your during development, right? Like what you should do in the planning phase, what you should do when you have during the requirement analysis and design, what you should do when your developers are coding their code, testing and operation. So those are some of the drivers that basically started the discussion around SBOM and why it's becoming like a hot topic. I will just call out very briefly on the timeline on what are the drivers. So we can see that basically May 2017, OWASP, who is like the global thought leader when it comes to application security, started with this SBOM initiative in order to understand what you got. And then 4 years later, we have seen like the Biden's executive order. Then a few months later, we're seeing like the NIST. So the main thing here is that most organizations and most government agencies need to follow that executive order. So meaning that the government requires all organizations to go and improve their cybersecurity response, detection, and the way that they deliver their software. And that usually will, as you may guess, in the following future, will also impact third-party organizations that want to work with the government to, of course, to assure business continuity. And as we have seen in other standards, usually those are being adopted in other regions, like Europe, Asia, and of course other regions as well.
So SBOMs came into effect as a reaction to some extreme calamities, cybersecurity breach calamities, and the US government felt it really had to do something about that. An SBOM is not necessarily a piece of cybersecurity technology. It is an attempt to bring more rigor and more governance into the way in which cybersecurity is provisioned. Although I think that there are some opportunities to extend SBOMs to make them much more secure, as you're going to talk about earlier on. Where are we at now with SBOMs? Are they being rolled out? You said that they're a condition of business if you want to trade and supply the US government or US government agencies. What's the current situation with SBOMs? Are companies rapidly having to catch up with them and make sure that they have them in place so that they can continue their business?
So we are seeing a couple of implementations. So first of all, in every organization, since like March 2022, like that executive order came into place, and government institutions are required to follow and having an SBOM and maintaining an up-to-date SBOM that basically call out what they work and what they have within their organization. On the other hand, we are also seeing when organizations are trying to interact with each other through contracts, they want to understand who are the third parties that are working with that organization. So essentially, we are already starting to see implementations of SBOM within the field.
Okay, but it's relatively early days. And it's worth pointing out that the SBOMs do affect a broad range of businesses across vertical sectors and industries. They also apply to suppliers who are outside of the US. So if you are a supplier who is in Europe or anywhere else in the world, you need to know about a software bill of materials and what your compliances there are.
This is 100% accurate. For example, in some countries, there are regulations that they are not allowed to do business with organizations from other countries, right? So this is part of an SBOM, right? Who are your suppliers, right? Like if I need to provide something. So definitely if I want to make business with the US administration, but definitely if I want to make business with other organizations. So we are already start to seeing more and more standards that copy the key points of an SBOM in other countries and in other organizations. Some examples would be critical infrastructure, right? Like critical infrastructure usually is supervised by governments, and they need to assure continuity. So definitely they are required to follow those standards and then have an SBOM part of that flow.
So industries that are already highly regulated are likely to become very early adopters of SBOM-like regulation, both in the US and elsewhere in the world. I think a key point that you've mentioned there is that this is not just like another piece of regulation that needs to be complied with, a tick box exercise. SBOMs can provide additional layers of IT security value. Is that the case?
100%. So SBOM is not just like a software bill of material. It's basically changing the mindset on how you're addressing, how you gain visibility over what you have, how you improve the transparency. And maybe it's worth calling out like what are the key benefits here, right? Like the ability to improve the transparency over what your organization is composed from and what are the things that your environment is composed from is key. The second thing is about gaining visibility, right? Like today organizations are gaining visibility over what they have by corridor conversations, by questioning people, by digging into some technologies. It's very hard to understand like what you got. It's a very hard task, by the way. And the second thing is, of course, giving accountability, right? Because I can properly mitigate the risk and I can properly address and understand what I should focus on from a risk point of view only when I have visibility on my SBOM. Like what are the things that are assemble my environment, my application code, and so on and so forth. So basically like having that proper SBOM, giving you, number one, the ability to understand how your application looks like, what is being composed from. The second thing also helps you to track and manage technologies within the application, right? Because it's not just like a list of dependencies and like a grocery store list. It's more about like a classified a list that you can go and take action. The third piece is, of course, helping you to assess security risks within the application. Like how can you assess the risk without knowing what you have, right? This is the baseline. And of course, the fourth pillar, if we're going back to the compliance drivers, is how can I go and address vulnerabilities and meet my compliance requirements, right? Because it's all about mitigating and reducing the risks within my environment and making sure that my customers' data is safe and sound.
Okay. And what more can we learn about what an SBOM really is from information that's included in the executive order, which has obviously been very influential in defining expectations around SBOM and some of the other sort of regulations around it? Do you want to say something about what the executive order actually specifies an SBOM should achieve? Because it's not an open brief. You have to comply with certain specifications.
Yeah. So I guess before we touch about how the executive order touches it, let's touch for a second how the industry looks about it. Right? So today we already have like a couple of industries, from an SCA, which stands for software composition analysis, and you have the IAC market, and you have the API security market. Like everyone speaks in SBOM lingo. But if you will ask your SCA provider, what is an SBOM? They will tell you, oh, this is clear. It's only the third-party dependencies, and it's only the package versions and the licenses which are associated with that, and what are the vulnerabilities which are associated with that. If you will go to another type of tool, like an infrastructure as code, so they will tell you, oh, this is all of your infrastructure as code components, from Terraform modules and other production assets, like where the artifacts are being stored, and what are the vulnerabilities. If you will go to API security, they will tell you what are the endpoints. So this goes very broadly, and it's very, very diversified. But as you suggested, if we go back to the executive order, so what they're saying, like, you need to maintain an accurate and up-to-date data provenance of software code or components and controls, or internal and third-party software components, tools, and services, and it's go on and on. So you can see the definition is like way, way broader than just like that very simple definition that every vendor took to his own domain. And you can also see that from other thought leaders in the space, like OWASP. So the Cyclone DX is also touching additional points. It's also touch about who is the supplier, what are the components that assemble your SBOM, what are the dependencies, right? Like if I have a piece of software, so there is the proprietary code that my developers are writing, but they are bringing in additional open source software. Where did open source software came from? What is this open source software that is being used to build my application? Where is my code being stored? So there are many different elements that I have to know in order to really understand my software bill of material, both from the supply chain and also from the application point of view.
And just to get back to basics and explain, the reasons why suppliers need to do this is to ensure that no security vulnerabilities have entered the application from one of these primary sources. That they're trying to identify any potential vulnerabilities, any exploits that could be in there that could end up in their application and create a security problem. That's the real rigor that they're trying to bring to this. Aidan, is there anything else we need to talk about before we move on to look at what's missing from an SBOM, or can we proceed to that? Is there anything that we need to add, or can we talk about what the limitations of SBOMs are from your perspective?
Yeah, so just to quickly summarize what you've covered by now, right? Like we covered like what drives an SBOM, why everyone is speaking about SBOM, all the compliance standards that organizations need to follow from the past year until now and in the following years. Like we are seeing like wider adoption of an SBOM approach. We then talked about what are the different vendors, right? Like what are they calling out as an SBOM? And then we went back to those compliance standards to see what they actually means. So now I think it would be very useful to go and cover what is actually missing in a typical SBOM. Yeah. And now if I take the environment and organizational environment, so number one, you have the supply chain, and that supply chain is composed from third-party software that you're working with, right? Like your SCM, you use GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps. What is the software that you are using in order to build your application? Do you use Jenkins? Do you use Circle CI? And of course, others, good and others. And you have the supply chain understanding. So this is bucket number one. Then you have the second bucket about how your application code looks like. What are the code modules? What are the serverless? Where you have APIs? What are the security controls that are in place? Where you got sensitive data? How is it being processed? How is it being stored? And again, all of those are going back. That understanding helps us to understand where the risk might come from, where a motivated attacker can go and attack our infrastructure. So these are crucial points, part of the bill of material, which are not included in the traditional coverage, that one must get knowledge in order to have a real visibility into what they got. Yeah, so this is from a missing point of view. So if you want to introduce, I guess, let's say introduce the term, what is the extended bill of material, right? So basically taking all those missing gaps, taking everything that the industry looked so far, looking at the compliance standards and tie them both together in order to understand how your environment looks like from an architectural point of view. And from a third-party interactions point of view, you need to know, number one, what are the supply chain components and what are the application components? So you need to know what are the code modules, where do you got APIs, what are the serverless functions, for instance, where you have data models that interact with sensitive data. And of course, by the way, those are not living in a silo, right? Like we'll show it in a couple of minutes, but it's important also to understand the relationship between them. What are the security controls that you have in place, like from encryption to authentication to authorization? Some of those are crucial to meet the compliance standard. Others just crucial to improve security. Which generative AI frameworks am I using within my environment, which is a very hot topic these days, right? Like everyone trying to do ChatGPT within their frameworks. It imposes multiple different types of risks and compliance risks, like which data is being processed and so on and so forth. So getting that visibility is crucial when you think about an XBOM.
Right. So an extended software bill of materials, an XBOM, is what's a good way to think about it in relation to a standard SBOM? Is it a superset? Is it an additional layer of security? How it's not an alternative to an SBOM, or is it? Is it built on top of an SBOM?
So the extended bill of material, of course, holds inside of it, like it's more of like a superset that holds the traditional SBOM. It's definitely part of it. It's important. But there are additional elements which also speaks about the relationship which also speak about the relationships within the different elements, which also speak about what's the origin of that bill of material, who worked on it, what type of application it serves, and so on and so forth. So those are the things that are also included in the XBOM and not included in the traditional SBOM.
And an XBOM is existing as a software tool as well. Is that a good way to understand it?
Yeah.
Or as a reference model?
XBOM is an approach. Theoretically,
an approach. Yeah.
It's an approach. It's an approach, but definitely that you already have tooling in place that helps you to generate that XBOM. You can also use multiple tools. We, for example, in Apiro provide an XBOM out of the box, but definitely there are other ways to get it manually in different way.
Well, let's move on to talk about what you're doing at Apiro. We're about midway through our webinar now. I'll just take this opportunity to remind our audience that if they do have questions they want to put to our speaker, Idan Elor, please use the box under the viewer's screen. Let's move on. We've talked about software bill of materials. We've talked about extended software bill of materials as the next level of SBOM, the next development. Apiro clearly believes that XBOM adoption is a game changer for application and supply chain security. Can you explain a little bit about how SBOMs apply to application and supply chain components in a security environment, and what the connections are there?
So definitely. So first of all, I would say that Apiro is part of the SBOM market, which stands for Application Security Posture Management. It's a new category recently defined by Gartner. We'll also share some links later in the phase. But the idea of the Application Security Posture Management understands the complexity that organizations follow today with diversity of technologies, diversity of a maturity level of development teams, different types of technologies, different types of practices. And it's very hard to take all of these bits and pieces across your organizations and put on them under one policy. And even if you remember the initial goal of an SBOM, which is about gain visibility, right? And improve transparency. So this is becoming a very hard task for organizations. So the SBOM market as a whole is helping about gaining that visibility so you can be more effective from an application security standpoint of view around risk prioritization, like how to prioritize the vulnerabilities, how to drive compliance activities as early as possible to help the organization in the end of the day to move faster. So this is the ASPM market. When you think about the XBOM, it really sits nicely within that market, because it's all about gaining visibility and improve the efficiency of your application security team in your DevSecOps initiatives, which are, again, part of the executive order, part of the compliance standard that you need to meet. So when you think about, okay, so cool, I understand I need it. I work in an organization which is super diversified. I have multiple different tools, multiple different teams. I want to improve security and have like a good foundation of it. So the thing that you need to keep in mind when you're evaluating an SBOM, you need to know what are the security controls. You need to be able to answer on questions like, which security controls are in use, right? Like, what are the encryption technologies that are in use? Which authentication or authorization? So, and in the absence of those tools, I can go and improve security by talking with engineering teams. Or what are the application components that you got? Like, what are the code modules? What are the SDKs? Where are the APIs? What are the interaction points with the customers or with the users? All of those, again, are critical to understand in order to prioritize the risk effectively, because you will always be understaffed. Your engineering team will always need to provide business value, and you want to become an enabler and not as a blocker, as traditionally security has been so far. Additional categories that you would like to be able to answer on: what are the languages that are being used, so I can select the tools that secure my application more effectively? What are the open source licenses? Where do you have data models? Where do you have sensitive data? How is it being stored, processed by my application? What are the infrastructure components? So this all like basically like a detailing of all the SBOM and XBOM approach. Like, what should I do practically when I'm approaching an SBOM? And if you take all of this foundation of visibility, you can now put the risk layering, right? Because now that I understand where I have APIs and where I have sensitive data and how it's being processed, now I can more effectively prioritize my vulnerability and manage safely the sensitive data extraction, license issues, or infrastructure as code misconfiguration. So all of that is critical in order to improve security when you think about also like evaluating an SPM and consider that type of tool in your organization.
So it's a means to provide a common space for interaction between all the vested parties, the stakeholders who are in there. It's about visibility, not just into your software components, into your IT assets, into your security policies, but also visibility into your procedures, into your governance frameworks, into the rigor that you bring to day-to-day operations. It's in some ways redefining the sense of visibility that people have had. What are some of the other things to bear? Sorry, what are some of the other information that could be provided by an Xbox? For example, do we touch on things like metadata and sort of component relationships? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So the slide before, we talked about the XBOM, from what we need to cover, what's that grocery list that we need to have in order to understand the ingredients of our organization. But it's also interesting, not in a silo, but also like, what are the relationships? What's the origin? What was the trigger that introduced that type of bill of material element? So for that, I would like to understand, what is the material chain, right? Like, for example, what is the code change? Who is the developer that actually introduced that particular element? Because if I have a further inquiry and my risk GRC guys will ask me like, hey, you introduced like a software that that impose risk to our organization from a legal point of view. Why did you do it? What's the impact? Do we have any way to work around it? So understanding like, what's the origin, what's the material change, who is the code owner, understanding if there is any vulnerability or misconfiguration data which is associated with that bill of material element, understanding the relationship, and we have like a good visualization in the next slide. It basically shows like, why is it important to even like understanding like which code modules has APIs and which API involves sensitive data, and how is it all exist in production and runtime so we can be more exposed. So the XBOM approach, it's not only about listing everything, it's also about understanding the relationship between different components.
Great stuff. We're starting to get some questions in from our viewers, so I'm anxious to leave some time at the end of the webinar for you to address those. Let's start. Let's sort of pivot a little bit and focus onto Apiro and what Apiro is how Apiro is positioned to address this market, what solutions you have. I know there's a concept called deep ASPM and its relationship to XBOM. Could you explain and expand a little bit about how those two concepts fit together from Apiro's point of view?
Definitely. So first of all, let's understand like what are the benefits of adopting the XBOM approach, and then it will tie very nicely like how Apiro might help you to embrace that approach into your environment. So first of all, the SBOM approach helps you in the end of the day to put all of the ingredients on a graph and understanding where, and to paint like that, find those toxic combinations where risk might come from, right? So you can identify the code module that have APIs that is built in a non-secure CI/CD that goes to a container and then deployed in an internet-facing artifact. But embracing that approach helps you, number one, to improve, to streamline your processes and enhance and improve your security, meet your compliance standards, and of course, improve the transparency. So what about how Apiro is doing it? So we actually connect to your tools in your SDLC. The most important one, of course, would be to analyze your code inventory. And we analyze every code change from the very beginning. We will analyze the code change, the commit message, the pull request discussion, and we will build an inventory and detect all of the risks within your application code. So essentially, by design, we will build that extended bill of material, which will be kept up to date and will be updated with every new change within your environment, from introducing a new tool to getting a new repository, for having a new pipeline, or just introducing a new API. Mm-hmm. Then having that layer will help you to prioritize and assess the risk by having that deep understanding of your environment. And of course, we will help you to remediate and measure your risk so you can improve your organization over time. So this is how the XBOM approach all connected about risk reduction and risk mitigation. And just to give you like a few examples from our platform. So sure. You see here, for example, like what are the technologies that are being used? So now the SBOM is not just like a list of all the dependencies that I got. It's a list. It's a classified list that tells you exactly which technologies are being used. Where is the generative AI frameworks? What are those? So I can go and run a proper review on them. How many developers are working within my environment? Those sounds trivial questions, but for practitioners, they will find those very hard to answer on. Having an audit trails. I don't care about all the changes. Help me to understand what are the changes that impose risk to my organization, or that might cause me to violate the compliance policy. And of course, help me to understand the architectural diagram so I can get better decisions based on data and not based on attestation, as everyone are following today.
Great stuff. Aidan, we have some questions coming in from our viewers. Do you want to answer those now, or do you want to add anything before we move into the last 5 minutes of the webinar? Should we move to some?
Yeah, we can move to the questions. Definitely.
Okay, we've got 3 in, and they're very interesting questions indeed. Anonymous says SBOMs were an historic requirement within MIL environments. However, they do not regularly see the demand either within audits nor from customers. How deep is the expectation to accurately map SBOMs, DLLs, and other integrations to software being used? I guess they're saying how deep is the requirement for them. Obviously, from your point of view, Apiro's point of view, you see that demand there. Is this still a growing awareness, or obviously it's something you expect to pick up?
So for now, as we are seeing it, it's a growing trend, and it's getting like more layers and layers in as it moves forward, and it lists more and more under more dependencies under its umbrella. I will say that maybe specifically DLLs or specific artifacts, they wouldn't usually from what I've seen in different compliance standards, they wouldn't necessarily care about specific DLLs or specific artifacts, but they would definitely care to understand like what's the origin and what assemble those SBOM. So it's more about dependent who you're interacting with. There are some organizations that will be more explicit and more strict about which software you've been using on, and others will be more open. And of course, there are technological gaps. For example, generate a bill of material for a C++ code or a C code is super hard, right? Because it's not managed in a package manager like we talked about DLLs and jars and stuff like that. So we are seeing some, the industry is still trying to understand to some extent like how to use it and what are the elements that needs to be covered within the notion of an SBOM. But we definitely like start to see more and more elements are getting baked in. I haven't seen specifically that group part of the compliance startup, but definitely it would be an interesting one to dig in more.
Yeah, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is there is a business imperative behind this, which, as we alluded to at the beginning of the webinar, in order it's a condition of business. There is a commercial imperative to making sure that businesses understand SBOMs and XBOMs and really know the extent to which they should be adopting them. Alex is interested to know, he says, considering the complexity of software, how is this scheme going to work in practice, and how will liability and ownership work, or how liability and ownership will work? So I'll just repeat that. Considering the complexity of software, how is this scheme, which I guess means SBOMs, going to work in practice, and how is liability and ownership going to work? Maybe a way to approach a reply to that question is to look at who's going to own SBOMs within a typical enterprise. Is this a governance issue? Is it a technology issue? Is it the IT or the security are going to have oversight of SBOMs and XBOMs? Could you say a little bit about that?
So I can say that in practical, from some instances of SBOM that I've seen, you will see it not only in government interactions points, you can also see it like in due diligence, right? Like there are companies acquiring other companies. The person who needs to run a due diligence on the acquired company will go to that company and will ask them, get me an SBOM. He might not call it an SBOM, but he will ask it like, which technologies you're using, what are the frameworks, send me a list of all the dependencies that the open source dependencies that is being worked on. As a person who's been into some instances during his career, I can definitely say that I've seen engineers working day and night just to extract that information. So as long as you don't have an automated way to have that efficiently baked into your development process, it's going to be like a very hard manual process. From what I've seen so far, the common denominator for SBOM would be the dependencies to some extent when you want to meet the legal and the compliance requirements. But if you want to go and improve your security, you need to have like broader scope and broader understanding on how your SBOM looks like, what's the application code that is baked in. And usually this is done by risk assessment and by others. It's not necessarily documented on a graph, but definitely it's a type of information that you're collecting part of your assessment. I hope it answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so. I think that's a good answer. And finally, we have another Alex, a different Alex, who asks a more generic question. This Alex says, is this XBOM currently a proposed approach or an available tool? I think basically just some clarification there, because at the beginning of the webinar, it is not a proposal. It's in practice. It's being implemented as a concept. And is it an available tool? So perhaps you could clarify, just maybe reiterate the fact that XBOM is happening. It's out there, and it is a requirement. And maybe clarify again what an XBOM is. I mean, you have addressed this question earlier on, but I think it would be valuable just to clarify again. Is an XBOM a tool, a framework, a concept, all of the things? What is the shorthand explanation for XBOMs?
So an XBOM, first and foremost, it's a framework and it's an approach. It's an approach that can get practical baked into day-to-day in organizations that try to move fast, mostly with the tool. Like it can be driven manually, but it's very hard Sisyphic work. And in order to adopt an XBOM approach, you need a tool that will first give you that visibility over what you have and will help you to maintain that XBOM. And you might say that for your organization requirement, your XBOM might be the SBOM, which is the legal standards, but you also need to have some part of the XBOM in order to improve security or meet your organization standards. But of course, it's more like an approach. And definitely it's in a tool. Like I'm happy specifically to take you through how we are doing it in Apira and how you can get that framework into the practical. I will also say on the side that OWASP recently also like adopted an XBOM, our XBOM approach. So we'll definitely like refer you to that one as well if you would like to learn more. So it's a framework, it's a concept, and it's also can be achieved with the tooling.
Lots of more information about that, I'm sure, on the Apira website. But before we get to that, before we move towards the conclusion of the webinar, Aidan, are there any other points that we need to include before we start to look at some of the further reading points that you have? Anything that you just want to add to what we've already covered?
No, I think we covered all of it. I would just like summarize that SBOM is something which is being raised and it's being driven. It's being driven also by the community and also by different vendors that are suggesting and proposing to that. The entire goal of it, in the end of the day, is to help organizations, number one, to meet compliance standards, which is the common denominator for every software organization that wants to meet a requirement. But on the other hand, it's a huge enabler for improving security and taking your entire application security operation to the next step, and then from all the traditional and manual work that you've been used to doing the past few years.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. For any of our webinar audience who want to locate further information about some of the technology that we've been discussing over the last 35 minutes, we have a slide which is headed further reading, which links through to information sources from Apira. We've got some good stuff there, 16 ways in which the extended software bill of materials goes beyond SBOMs. So that will reiterate some of the points that Aidan has been explaining over the last half hour, and give some real-time application attack surface visibility and risk assessment. 17 core components of ASPM to unify application risk visibility, assessment and prioritization and remediation. And there's also, I believe, Aidan, a Gartner Innovation Insight report. Can that be downloaded?
Yeah, definitely. Like you can get it from our website and just like read more about how Gartner defined the ASPM market and what are the things to keep in mind and what is the problem that the ASPM market is trying to solve. So just more understanding about the growing complexity in cybersecurity threats and how organizations should approach in order to mitigate risks in the future.
So that's a report, a briefing paper that can be downloaded. Great stuff. Well, alas, we have just about used up our time for this register webinar and have to draw the proceedings to a close. I want to thank our expert speaker, Aidan Ilor, who's the Global Solutions Engineering Manager at Apira, for sharing his perspectives on these critical issues as we've discussed over the last 35 to 40 minutes. We very much hope you've gained insights that will inform and guide conversations around IT decision-making inside your organization as a result of that. And so with that, until next time, from me, James Hayes, it's goodbye.